Russia's invasion of Ukraine has prompted an unprecedented response from the West. Economic warfare.
The European Union and its partners are working to cripple Putin's ability to finance his war machine. We are resolved to continue imposing massive costs on Russia.
Western sanctions have sent shockwaves across Russia's economy.
The ruble has sunk to another record low.
But will it be enough to stop Putin? Our experts weigh in. What sanctions have been imposed on Russia, and how severe are they?
One category is financial sanctions. There have been various measures targeting Russian banks. A number of them have been blocked from SWIFT, which is a messaging system for cross-border payments. And then on top of the banking sanctions, there's a number of measures involving sovereign debt, including restrictions to secondary trading of Russian sovereign debt. And Russian companies and banks have had their access to Western financial markets cut. But the biggest bazooka of all on the financial front is the sanctions against the Central Bank of Russia. The third category, I'd say, is measures targeting Vladimir Putin himself, members of his circle, and a number of oligarchs who are seen as either being close to him or supportive of the Kremlin. And, there we've seen asset freezes, travel bans, and so on.
And the thing, Matthew, I'm sure will agree with this, is the thing that really made a big difference is this threat to freeze the $630 billion of assets that the central bank holds overseas. And that's really the sort of safety net that backstops Russia's entire economy.
What effect have sanctions had so far, and what's likely to happen to the Russian economy?
The effect of sanctions is really to create a kind of heart attack in Russia's financial system, and that's the first and most important effect. So you've seen the ruble fall as people worry about capital flight, worry that the central bank no longer has the foreign assets it needs to defend the currency. The share prices of Russian firms that are traded in Moscow or offshore have collapsed, including the banks. And all of that filters through into a kind of generalized loss of confidence in the financial system, and there are queues of Russians outside bank branches across Russia at the moment. Beyond that, I think a big question mark is how much the energy sector and trade in oil and gas is affected by this. They have notionally been excluded from the sanctions regime, but the complexity of dealing with Russia in order to buy Russian oil or gas seems to be putting a lot of people off, which is why the oil price has now hit $110 roughly.
Yeah, I think that's right, Patrick. And I'd add a couple of things to that. One is, that, according to some estimates, and one of them is based on real-time data, we're seeing inflation spiking to quite an alarming level, by one estimate, 70% on an annual basis, which is obviously something to watch very closely and something that will impact very heavily on ordinary Russians. And a broader point to make is that, this really shows that the strategy that Russia had, the Fortress Russia strategy they had, as they called it, which was to insulate the economy from sanctions, which they introduced almost a decade ago after earlier sanctions in relation to Crimea, that really looks like a Potemkin structure. It's crumbled away.
What has Russia's response been so far?
What Russia's sought to do is try and invent a playbook off the cuff to deal with having a major financial crisis on its hands. And there are a variety of stabilization things that they've tried to do in the financial markets to restore confidence, but there's not a magic bullet for them because the bulk of their foreign assets, which is the backstop of the system, are under threat of being frozen. The big question is whether Russia chooses to escalate, not just in a military fashion, which is what it's doing in Ukraine right now, but in an economic fashion against the West. It could try and curtail gas exports to Europe. That's a real pressure point. There are various specialist metals where Russia's exports are pretty important to global supply chains. Or cyber attacks could be another tool attacking Western economic rather than military interests.
In terms of the economic retaliation, it's been very muted so far. I mean, one of the only things that Russia has done is to announce a tit-for-tat ban on planes from a number of countries using its airspace and using its airports. And interestingly, if Russia does manage to take full control of Ukraine, it could hold back things like rare gases, which Ukraine is a big supplier of and which are used in the manufacture of semiconductors. They're important in semiconductor etching. So that's just one example of a lever it could pull on the basis of taking control of Ukraine if it manages to do that.
Will economic warfare help to stop Putin?
I don't think anyone, including Western leaders and officials, thought that sanctions alone would persuade Vladimir Putin to pull his troops out of Ukraine. I don't think anyone was naive enough to think that even dramatic financial sanctions would on their own do that. But sanctions are about several things, really. And one is, I suppose, on a basic level, just showing that there's a cost to be paid. That if you're if you engage in something as reckless as invading a neighbouring country, that you're going to pay a price.
The glass half empty view on this is sanctions have already kind of failed. They failed to deter the invasion of Ukraine and will probably fail to lead Russia to end that invasion and retreat back within its own borders. But I think the glass half full view is rather different, and it's that in the short term, sanctions change the incentives potentially of Russia's leadership and Mr. Putin, and that it creates a dynamic where if they scale back the violence in Ukraine, there can be a reciprocal scaling back, partial scaling back of economic sanctions. So it gives the West an ongoing lever with which to try to influence Russia's behavior. And it may be that lever yields results. If it does not, and Russia continues on its path of action in Ukraine, causing devastation, then sanctions still have a different function, which is to significantly weaken Russia's economic capabilities. And in the end, that will have a significant impact on its military capabilities over time.
Thank you for watching. For more of our coverage on Ukraine, please click on the link and don't forget to subscribe.